Hello, and welcome to this episode of the podcast for the Eastbourne Literary Festival, the festival whose mission is to convince you that you are a writer. I'm Russ Miles, a local writer, listener, and festival instigator, and in this podcast I will be chatting to many diverse and interesting writers about how they write to inspire you to pick up your pen, keyboard, or even phone and start writing. Today we are joined by a writer in technology, Charles Humble. Charles is a former software engineer, former architect in software, and a former CTO. But before you say this podcast may not be for you, the software is being left gently to the side and we're going to be diving into all of Charles's experiences of being a writer. He's been an editor-in-chief at online publication InfoQ from 2014 to 2020 and was also chief editor for Container Solutions, a technology consultancy from 2020 to 2023. He writes regularly for many publications and is also a highly experienced content strategist and has spoken at many international conferences. Most recently, Charles has published a developer's guide to cloud infrastructure, efficiency and sustainability, and he's a valued member of the Software Inklings community based on LinkedIn. Charles, after all of that, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Russ. It's lovely to be here. It's a real pleasure to join you.
It's a pleasure to have you here. We've been trying to get Charles on the podcast for a while now, and finally he's found the time. What a career you've had. I know that's probably the longest and probably the most complex introduction I've ever had to navigate on the podcast. Of all of that career, what topics across it all has been the most interesting for you to dive into? Has there been anything there that you look back on and you go, oh wow, I remember writing about that and it being something that ignited me. It was something that maybe you've carried through your entire career.
Oh, what an interesting place to start. I think, one of the things about my career is it's very accidental. I never had a plan. I read English literature at university, and I read English literature at university because I'm dyslexic and I had an English A-level teacher who told me I shouldn't. And I'm the sort of person who, when I'm told I shouldn't do something, immediately says, right, I shall do that then. And I didn't like him much either, if I'm honest. So I think I went and read English literature mostly just to annoy him. So I did that for 3 years and had a brilliant time and, graduated with a 2-1 and then thought, what on earth does one do with an English literature degree? But I'd sort of grown up with computers. So I got an initial job in publishing and did that for about a year, I think, and didn't much like it, if I'm honest, and wasn't very good at it. But then I realised there were all these things I could do that involves automating stuff and writing bits of code. So I kind of accidentally backed into a career as a programmer. It was very, very unintentional. I did a stint in desktop support and kind of gradually made my way up. And then I did a startup that got acquired, and that was quite a significant moment. And that was an interest. I mean, it wasn't a writing thing; it was a software thing. But it was interesting it wasn't really interesting from a technology point of view. But it was interesting in that it was solving a very particular problem in a very pragmatic way. But after I'd done that, I had this sort of fateful New Year's Eve with my wife. I think I'd probably drunk one too many glasses of sparkling wine or something. And I said, I really want to do something else. And as it turned out, C4 Media, who is the company that owns InfoQ, had actually approached me about 6 months earlier, I think, to ask if I would take over as chief editor. And I was doing a startup. So I said, no, that seems like a terrible idea. And when my wife and I were chatting, she was like, well, did they ever hire anyone? Because that sounded really interesting. I was like, I don't think they did. Dyslexic chief editor, that sounds insane. I wonder if that's a thing. It doesn't sound like a thing. So I went and joined InfoQ. And I'd written, it wasn't completely out of the blue. I'd written for them before. So I'd written for them on what was called the Java queue. So about Java, which is, a large programming language. And I'd done that and been head of a Java queue for about 6 years. So it wasn't totally random, but it was kind of fascinating. And I loved InfoQ's approach. I loved InfoQ's kind of mission. Something in it really resonated with me, and it really connects actually with your theme for the Eastbourne Festival. This idea that anyone can be a writer. So what InfoQ does is it takes engineers, software engineers, programmers, and it teaches them how to write. So most tech writing is people who've done journalism who have an interest in technology. Right? That's normally how it works. So a lot of these people haven't written software, don't necessarily know much about the field, but do know how to write. And InfoQ kind of took the other way. And I just found that a really interesting model and got really excited about it. But it also was this thing of, as an industry, the software industry, I think, is very bad at explaining what it does. It's very bad at explaining what it does to itself. And it's also very bad at explaining what it does outside of IT. And that matters more and more because what we do is so pervasive. So, it used to be that software wasn't that important because it didn't impinge that much on people's lives. But now that's completely not true. Like all the time, everybody is interacting with bits of software that our industry writes. And I think we need to get much better at both communicating what we're doing, but also thinking through the implications of what we're doing. So I suppose, at the risk of sounding very sort of pompous, part of what underlines what I'm doing now is trying to get us as an industry to think more about that, about how we build things in a responsible, ethical kind of way. Because I think on the whole, we've not been good at that. If you go and read computer science, you don't generally do an ethics course. But some of the stuff we're doing has huge ethical implications. The other side of it is fundamentally what drives me is I like making things. I just like making stuff, but I'm rubbish at physical things. I can't if I put a shelf up, it'll fall over. If I could just about make a bookshelf, maybe, but that would be a stretch. So I have to work in abstract. So all of the things I do, I write music for fun, and I've done that all of my life really, and I write words for sort of professionally now, but again, it's something I've always done. And also making software is about making things, and that's really what I enjoy. I enjoy the process of there is nothing, and now I have literally brought something into being, into existence, and I get immense pleasure from that very sort of strange abstract process. So I think that's really kind of at the core of what I do. I mean, there are other things I like, helping people and elevating people and those sorts of things. But fundamentally, I just like making things. And I've been very lucky to find ways to do that have paid the bills along the way.
I love that. I love the fact that it's about the making things, and particularly in respect to writing, which perhaps isn't always seen through the lens of making something. That phrase wouldn't always be foremost in someone's mind. If you said they're a writer, you'd probably think of them sitting alone in a cupboard somewhere writing away and avoiding making anything in the real world, if you like. I can see how it fits that mold. It fits that desire. Just wanted to pick up on something you mentioned there about the software industry generally not being great at communicating what it does, its reasons, and some of perhaps the complications in what it does. And you mentioned computer science as well. And I wondered if it resonated with you in some way, in that there's been some criticisms recently that in software engineering and computer science, we don't really use the burden, but also the benefit of all the knowledge we already have. We're continually reinventing the wheel. And for those that aren't too technical listening, you can imagine this, that every sort of 5 to 7 years, I suppose, we reinvent things that were invented and discarded perhaps 7 to 10 years previously. And it can be very frustrating for people working in the industry to see this happen, because it doesn't give a sense of progress. It gives a sense of pause. And I wondered if part of this emphasis you have, this passion you carry in writing, is perhaps trying to break that cycle just a notch and see if there's a way that helping people write better could help people communicate and build on knowledge better, just like a scientific discipline should. Does any of that make sense?
100%, absolutely 100%. It's a source of endless frustration to me that we don't, I mean, software is a funny discipline. I mean, it's one of the things that I think makes it really attractive and interesting to certain types of people, because it's part science, part art. I think there is again, this is difficult to explain to a non-technical audience, but there is an aesthetic quality that code has, and I get struck all the time at the parallels there are between the sort of writing that I now do, which is, obviously a very distinct branch of non-fiction writing, and what I used to do as a programmer. There are parallels there, but I think, and some of it's because we're actually a very young industry. I mean, really, we really only got going in the 1950s, which isn't that long in the great scheme of things. So part of it is that it's a very young industry, and part of it is also, I think, how it's taught. So if you go and learn, if you're like studying any other branch of engineering, there's a bunch of stuff about, I don't know, material behaviours and material science and things that are core parts of your knowledge. If you're going to be a physicist, there's a whole bunch of physical knowledge that you're taught, but that sort of doesn't quite happen in computing in the same way. There's a bit with algorithms, but not much. And so I do think we tend to spend a lot of time reinventing stuff. But there's also, I think there was something that happened when the industry stopped being a bit of a hobby space. So again, when I was growing up in the 1980s, we all learned to program on, home computers, 8-bit computers. I had a Commodore 64, which was, one of the machines of that era. But the point was that people who made a living writing code would share things they'd learned what to do with that machine in magazines, and then you could go and sort of learn from what everyone else was doing. But then when I joined the industry, that had changed, and part of the reason it had changed was because software had become very valuable. So it's become a bit like a sort of secret sauce, and we don't want to share what we're doing because that might give our competitors an advantage over us or something. And a lot of the time that isn't true, but there's that kind of thinking of software as being this sort of secret proprietary thing. And it was actually quite a surprise to me when I joined the industry that you couldn't find out, well, how is Company X doing that? And that's changed a bit. The various, open source movements and things have changed that a bit. But I think it's partly that there is another thread to this though, which I think goes all the way back to school. And I think there is a thing that happens at school at some point where we say to a bunch of children, you're not writers, you're scientists. And we say to another group of children, you're not scientists, you're artists, or something. And we kind of divide people. And it's totally ludicrous, but it's just how the school system works. And what that means is lots of the engineers that I was teaching at InfoQ had been told at some point that they weren't good, that they didn't have a gift for words, whatever one of those is. And that, this is nonsense, right? Writing is a craft, and like any craft, you can learn it. Yes, it requires a bit of effort. And I'm not saying, everyone can be the next Jeanette Winterson or something and, be like an amazing fiction writer. But everyone can learn how to communicate in the way that people will want to read your stuff and get to the end, particularly if it's non-fiction. But you've been told you can't, and you internalise that and you believe that. And so, you'll know this as well as I do. Most engineers don't want to do the documentation. The documentation is seen as like a lesser thing. And one of the things I realised quite early was liking doing that gave me a real advantage. Because there's nothing like doing a job that people don't want to do and then doing it really well. It really helps in all sorts of ways. So from a professional point of view, it gave me an advantage. But also, most of what we do is, in any business context, most of what we do is communication. And so getting good at communication will help whatever you're doing. I just happen to think that that software in general is particularly bad at it. And as I say, I'm sure some of it is because we sort of pull this awful idea, this awful burden through life that somehow we're not good at this thing, this mysterious writing art. It's like if you're writing code, that's kind of the same thing. Not quite, but sort of. There are very striking parallels. So frankly, if you can write a decent piece of code, there's no reason why you can't write an article. Those things are, in many respects, a lot of those skills are very similar. But you've been told you can't do it, so you don't. And that's become a big sort of thing for me. It's like, well, we really need to break that down because as an industry, we're not going to progress if we can't share knowledge.
I think that is a soundbite in itself, Charles. Thank you for that. It's one of those and I can see, in many respects, it's an appeal to bravery when you put it in that context. It's an appeal to courage to say that, you may have been given a message that didn't serve you, doesn't serve you in your profession, doesn't serve us as an industry, and doesn't serve probably humanity now that software is pervasive as it is. But bringing it back just gently to the writing, if I may, particularly your experience in journalism. And one of the conversations I had just today with some of the local schools for our festival was around how we could engage with some of the young adults, young children, and get them to do the journalism for the festival for us, rather than doing the typical let's engage all the journos in the way that the festival runs and do it the traditional way. Since the appeal to the young writers or the young possible writers is such a strong message in the festival, I thought with your experience in journalism, I wonder if there's any of the experience you've had that would be kind of the gold that you could offer to some of those young listeners that might be going, okay, I could maybe get into the writing thing along the side of the journalistic elements of it. And I know you've written in the past about the form and function of different journalistic approaches and how different publications emphasize different forms as well. But I wonder if there's a way you can talk about that and explain it from your experience that would appeal to the younger members of the audience.
Yeah, I'll go. Well, I'll give it a go. I mean, the first thing to say about writing is you get better by doing more of it. So if you want to be a writer, the most important thing you can do is just write. Literally just put one word in front of another word and don't get too hung up on, is this good enough? One of the joys of writing, particularly in the age of computers, is you can edit for as long as you like. So, like my own writing style, my own writing process, I will throw a lot of words at a page and not get too hung up on, are these in the right order? I mean, the sentences make sense, but are the sentences in the right places and stuff? I like to get something down. So I might, blat out 1,000 words in a morning, and then I'll spend the next day and a half moving them around and changing them and fixing them up. But that's my personal thing. But really, it's one of the things is just writing, literally just doing it by practicing. If you want to be a journalist, you kind of need to read journalism. So you need to read newspapers or magazines or whichever branch of journalism is you want to go into, I think. And you need to read a lot. And typically you'll learn quite a bit through imitation when you're starting out. So if there's a writer whose writing you admire, see if you can kind of copy the style or clone the style. And if you do that, yes, it might be a little bit sort of fan fiction-y, but you'll learn so much technique from other people's technique. And over time, you'll find your own voice. That doesn't happen, for most of us, that doesn't happen very quickly. But over time, you'll start putting together like a unique combination of things that you've learned from other people. There are patterns, there are sort of formulas that you can use. Formulaic writing has a really bad reputation that I think is a little unfair. In truth, most journalists have formulas that they use at least some of the time. The absolute classic is the Pyramid of News. It's called the Pyramid of News, but actually it applies just as well to any number of other forms. It's not just for news writing. But basically the idea of the Pyramid of News is you start with the most important thing. So your opening sentence or your opening paragraph, your opening, let's say 2 or 3 sentences, is the most important thing. It should be if it's a news piece, it should be the bit that's newsy, the hook. And then what you're trying to do with each consecutive sentence is you're trying to basically draw the reader through the narrative. And that's very different from how you're taught to write at school. Because how you're taught to write at school is you have an introductory paragraph, and then you have like a bunch of supporting paragraphs, and then at the end you basically summarise whatever you wrote before, and you kind of need to throw all of that away as a structure, particularly the summary bit. If you find yourself writing a conclusion, if you have like a conclusion as a subhead or a crosshead, you pretty much, your article will be creaking under the weight of its own conceit. You want your article to feel like it naturally comes to an end. So it is a different way of writing, but it's a really good one to learn because so much journalism kind of works that way. The other thing is within that structure, it's the most newsworthy thing, explain the most newsworthy thing, and then you get to more background as you go down. And again, you'll hear sort of old journalists talk about above the fold and below the fold, which dates back to when people read broadsheets on the train or the tube, and they'd fold them up. And the idea was you wouldn't read beyond about the first 3 or 4 paragraphs. You wouldn't read below the fold. So you wanted to get the most important information up the top. You can assume online that people won't read to the end. It's depressing but true. So one of the things I try to keep in my head is at any point that you stop reading, I want you to have taken away something relevant from the article. So if you've got this far, however far this is, there's something useful. I mean, it's like your job as the writer, part of your job as the writer is to try and reel the reader as far down to the end of the article or whatever it is as you can. So yeah, you can Google Pyramid of News and you'll probably find a Wikipedia article or something that will explain it. But that's a really good one to start with, I think. It was the one we used to teach everybody at InfoQ, and it's it's a very good starter article. One other bit of advice is get people to read your articles and get them to give you feedback, and be prepared for that feedback to be brutal. And in my view, the more brutal, the better. And that can be hard, right? No one likes being told, "Oh, it doesn't make any sense. What are you going on about?" But it's really important not to be too precious about your thing. Because as well as being a writer, I also edit a lot. And something I realized at some point is people get very attached to their first drafts, and they send me their first drafts imagining their first draft is sort of perfect in every way. And I can tell you it isn't. I won't let people see my first draft. I might let you see my second if we're feeling like it's going well. But my first draft is very, very far away. And so a lot of writing is actually editing and refining, and seek feedback. If you've got people around you, if you're lucky enough to have teachers at school, if we're talking school age, or people who write well that throw them the thing and say, "What do you think? How am I doing?" And ask them to, don't just say it's wonderful, give me proper feedback. Because that's how, that's another way that we all learn. It's basically the only way we learn, I think, is when someone tells us when we're not doing it well.
A couple of things I want to speak about there, because you've mentioned criticism and feedback, which is a really personal thing. It seems to be emerging across the podcast series, when people engage with feedback, where you mentioned if on your first draft, it can be perhaps not something you even want to show anybody else. And I think Holly mentioned in one of our early podcasts how ideas are something she will only run past very trusted individuals, because everything is so fragile at that early point.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. With particularly, I think maybe more with very creative writing, like novel writing, is when an idea is new, it's very, very easy for it to get squished. And there is definitely I'm trying to remember, I think it was Johnny Ive talking, I think it might have been the eulogy at Steve Jobs' funeral, which is a weird thing to mention, but it's just popped into my head. And I think he talks about this idea of, a new idea being very easily crushed or squished or something like that. And that's a really important thing. So yeah, I think it's a good thing to hang on to an idea until you feel like it's moving, it's got legs or whatever. If you have somebody who you really trust, who you work with a lot, that's a different thing. But that is a trust relationship. That's something you build up over time.
Absolutely. You don't want those fragile birds being caged and crushed too early. You mentioned, and I want to dig a little bit into your point there, actually, around find a journalist that you enjoy the style of and go and read what they're doing, and even mimic their approaches if you can, or try to deconstruct and see how they write. It echoes, for me, something that Joan Didion talks about in her mimicry of Hemingway. I think she talks about writing over and over again the same sentence of Hemingway to try to understand how you might think the way that then produces such a sentence.
Mm-hmm.
And I wonder if you can suggest, or even just even place on a pedestal, some of the journalists that you admire, that you read and go, that is somebody who is inspiring me as a journalist, even perhaps now.
There are certainly people. I think more commonly now, it's actually not so much from journalism for me, but it tends to come more from fiction reading. But there are absolutely journalists who have done work that I massively admire and draw on all the time. John Franklin wrote a book called Writing for Story, which is all about basically the craft of writing non-fiction. And that's, I don't know, it's a journalism sort of starter book, but it's a very good book to read if you feel that you're plateauing. Like, I feel like I'm not getting any better. And I went and read a bunch of his writing. So he won the Pulitzer Prize and things. He's pretty serious, a lot more serious than I am. But I went and read a lot of his articles, and they made a huge impression on me. But quite often as well, it will just be like something in a story where you go, how are you doing that? There's a book that came out a few years ago from Germaine Greer called White Beech, and there was a particular section in that where she went and visited a site that had, I won't give it away, but something fairly dramatic had happened to it in the colonial period. And she describes the feeling, like the place had a feeling about it. And she describes it, and it was so visceral. And I remember sitting there and just trying to, after I'd read the book for pleasure, probably twice, I then went and sat and spent a long time pulling that section together because I couldn't figure out how it was making me react the way I was reacting. And I think, so sometimes it's that sort of thing. It's those sort of things where you go, I could never do that. What are you doing? Sometimes it can be when you get those sort of very Gossamer Finn kinds of stories where that you feel like I can put my finger through the plot and this whole thing will fall apart, but it isn't doing that. And why is it not doing that? That's really fascinating. So I think a lot of it is that kind of thing. There are certain writers within the tech space who just are really great communicators, and some of them aren't particularly, they're not going to be household names necessarily, but there are just people who I think write really well. Anne Curry is someone who I always enjoy reading. Holly Cummings is another person who, whenever she writes, just joyful to read. So there are people like that I will always read a huge amount of everything those people put out because it's always interesting and quite often entertaining. Jennifer Riggins, who writes for the Newsstack and amongst others, is always interesting. So there are quite a few. Those aren't necessarily big influences on me, I think. There is another book, so William Zinsser's book on writing well, which I quote to everyone all the time. But On Writing Well was the book that probably informed the way I think about writing more than any other book. It is a beautiful, it's a wonderful expression of everything that I think about when I think about writing, expressed far better than I could ever express it. And honestly, if you take one thing, if you want to be a writer, going back to our youngsters who might want to be writers, if you want to be a writer, go and get William Zinsser's On Writing Well and read it slowly and carefully. There is so much good advice in there, in a relatively short and relatively enjoyable read. And that, I think, had a profound influence on how I write.
Always looking to add as many book references to the podcast as well, particularly anything that is so formative as well to how you write and how people can approach writing. I've got a couple of questions that I'd like to approach towards the end now, if it's okay. Before I get to those, though, I just want to ask you about a theme that has been emergent across the whole podcast series, which is how we find time to read. So finding time to write may be something that the day job even demands, but reading has become a theme of something that people have almost a little bit more consistent. Very little consistency in writing, a lot of consistency in needing to read. And so what's your reading habits like, Charles? What helps you write when you're engaging in the alternative, the consumptive part of the job?
So I tend to read at fairly fixed times of day. There is usually a period in my day between about 8 o'clock and about 9 o'clock in the evening, which is fairly free. And I always try and read then. In the winter, because I live in a very old, beautiful, drafty house, and so in the winter I will normally light the fire and sit by the fire with a book, and that's a joyful evening, and occasionally I might have a scotch with me. I read in bed a lot, like I think many of us do, so that's the other time that I read. If I'm working on something that's requiring a lot of research, which is fairly typical for me, so you mentioned the sustainability book, which is actually coming out tomorrow as we're recording. But I did a crazy amount of research for that, which meant I was reading all the time. That didn't leave me a lot of fiction reading time, if I'm honest. Like, by the end of the day, all I really wanted to do was, stare at a telly or something. If I'm doing something a bit less demanding than that, then yeah, it tends to be the evenings for me. And I probably read, an hour or two day on average, I should think. I have a deep love of reading that I think is partly down to the dyslexia. I think it's because it was really hard for me to learn how to do it. I learned to read late, really late. I was 12-ish, 12, 13 before I got the hang of it. And, when I started reading, my first books weren't, See Spot Run or whatever. They were like Clive Cussler, the sort of thing that would appeal to a 12-year-old boy who just learned to read. And I think part of my love of it was really hard. So I now I can do it for pleasure. I really enjoy reading, and I try and read very widely. So I try and read, all sorts of genres, and I read quite a lot of quite literary stuff. As I said, I read English at university, but I also try and read sort of outside of my comfort zone a certain amount as well. So, I'll dip into things that I suspect I won't like this, and sometimes I don't, and sometimes it surprises you. As I say, I try and read really, really widely. Actually, pro tip, there are probably others, but there's a bookshop called Mr. B's, which is a wonderful bookshop in Bath. Mr. B's has a book subscription service where they basically send you you fill in a long lengthy form and then they send you a book every month. So if you're looking for a present, like a birthday or a Christmas present for the reader in your life, I cannot recommend it highly enough. They also do like book spa days, so you can go to the shop and sit down with someone and they'll pull out lots of books, and that's brilliant because that will get you into areas that you go, oh, I wouldn't have thought of that, or it'll introduce you to all kinds of new things.
It's got so many echoes of a recent novel I've written that was, I think, translated from the original Japanese, which the title of the book is What You're Looking For Is in the Library, I think. And it's literally about a person in a library that will recommend a book to someone for their point in their life. And they may not yet know why they need that book or why it's going to play a part. And it's a joyous book. I'll make sure that's in the references from the podcast as well, and the books you mentioned, and Mr. B's as well. Coming towards the end now, my friend. 2 questions. First one is a challenging one, but it is an important one. It's an opportunity for you, and even all your extensive career of being interviewed and being the interviewer. Is there anything that you wished, any question that you wished you'd been asked, particularly about writing, that you've never been asked, that you've never had that opportunity to speak about? Is there anything you'd like to speak about this time?
Such a good question. I'm going to be slightly self-indulgent and bring music in, if I may. I attempted a career as a composer. It wasn't wildly successful. I mean, I had a great time, but I couldn't make enough money to really live off. So I had to go and do other things. But I still write music and I still play in bands and things. And the reason I mention it is because there is a writing connection and also a connection to that thing we were talking about with creativity. And so I have a music writing partner who I write with, and we've written together for more years than I care to remember. I'm going to say 30-ish, maybe, possibly, something like that. It might even be more than that. When we're writing music, so we write kind of instrumental, very hard to describe, kind of cinematic, vaguely electronic stuff. And quite often when you're writing a piece of music, and this can also happen when you're writing a piece of writing or writing a novel, you'll go down the wrong path at some point. And in fact, I've got an absolute example of it where we'd spent weeks and weeks and weeks on a section of a piece we're writing on at the moment, and we realised last week that we had just gone the wrong way and we had to throw a whole load of work away and start again. And the secret with that is 2 things. One, you need to trust the other person, and if they say this isn't working, they're probably right, because you tend to be precious about your own ideas. That's why working with an editor is such a joy, and I'm very lucky that I've got to work with lots of great editors over my writing career. So that's one thing. But the other thing is to remind yourself that you like doing the thing you're doing. So when we have to bin a load of music, your immediate reaction is, well, that's sad, because I spent ages getting that, arpeggio or that riff or that chord sequence or, whatever it is. I mean, some of our stuff is ridiculous, kind of, orchestras and goodness knows what going on. So it's like a lot of work that you're throwing away. But on the other hand, I like writing. I like writing music, I like writing. And so the key sort of change I had to make in my own head at some point was to go, well, then I get to do more writing. And that's the thing I like. And so that's fine. And the point there really is not to be too precious about the thing, to be happy. If someone comes in and says, that's going, to learn to be happy about that. to learn to go, okay, that's an opportunity to revisit that and maybe go in a different direction and what would happen. And sometimes, I mean, it's happened to me, it happens in writing, but it's probably happened to me more in music. But you get all the way to the end of a piece and then go, actually, do you know what, this doesn't work. Like it doesn't, I've spent a year on it or something, but at the end of it, it's just not very, it's not like I like all the bits, but when I put them all together, it's not quite working. And sometimes you can salvage those. You know, there's a piece on our last album that we were able to salvage. There are at least 2 pieces on this album that we will not salvage, that they're just not ever going to see the light of day because they weren't good enough. There will be a piece on the next album, I'm pretty certain, that was a completely different piece that didn't work, and then we started again. So we, you know, same starting tempo, same initial bass line, I think it was, and a couple of chords, and then went off in a completely different direction, and it's a completely different piece. But it's by the time we got to the end, it kind of suggested another way that it could be. And I think writing, I think anything creative is a bit like that. Sometimes you have to do it the wrong way to work out what the right way is. I keep meaning to write a talk about how being a composer made me a better software engineer or a better manager or something. I feel like there's a talk in there somewhere, if only I could get to it, but I haven't quite got it in my head yet. But yeah, anyway, that's the question I would love to have been asked. So there, I asked it myself.
I think it's perfect. I think it's great because actually it hammers home several similar thoughts from other writers as well in this. 2 things that often get mentioned. One, that nothing is wasted, that the process of creating it and exploring it is the valuable part, and you never know what it's going to turn into or not. And so you have to fall in love with that process in many respects. That comes across from your experiences as well as from other writers we've spoken to. And also this, you know, sort of different relationship that I'm kind of noticing as we do this podcast between creative writers, whatever they're writing about, and what we would notionally call the outcome, the success or failure. And it's almost letting go of that last piece and going, well, the outcome is the outcome, it's separate. There is the process of writing, there's the drafting, there's the exploring of it, there's the creating the music, and then there's the outcome. And the 2 don't rely on each other in value.
I think a mistake that lots of us make, if we're trying to, particularly I think if you're trying to make a career in a creative industry, is you get stuck in this idea of trying to make the thing that the audience wants. So you're trying to guess what does the audience want and you try and make that thing. And I think that's generally a mistake. I think you're much better off going, can I make, what do I want to make? What's the thing I want to hear, or what's the thing I want to read? And do that as well as you can, because that's where your uniqueness is. That's the thing that makes you you. And oftentimes I think where the value in art comes from is that uniqueness. It's that no one else would have put those things together. A lot of creativity, I think, comes from confluence. It comes from putting disparate ideas together and in a way that other people would not have thought of. And sometimes that works and finds an audience, and sometimes that doesn't find an audience. But I think it's much better to do that than try and produce the thing that you imagine that other people will want, because everyone can do that. Because all you're really doing is, you know, you might as well get a large language model or something to generate it, because all you're doing is generating a pre-existing thing, and there's no art there. There's nothing, to my mind, there's nothing interesting in that. It doesn't mean you can't do that for practice. That's a very different thing. Like, I'm going to go and write a trance hit or something. Lovely, knock yourself out. But if you're actually trying to make something of value, then that has to come from the thing that only you can do. And that takes hours and hours, by the way. That's not something that just happens. It only happens because you spent a bunch of time doing all sorts of other things. But that's fine. You know, if you like doing it, you just keep doing it. And eventually you start to find your own sound or your own voice or your own mechanism of expression that is distinct. And that's, I think, the point at which you have something.
The last question we have for today is going to be our standard question of going back in time to Charles Humble at around 16. And what would you go back to yourself and say, given all of your extensive career? And I don't want it to sound like we're only retrospecting here, by the way. There's all that career ahead of you too. But looking back over all that experience and going back to yourself at age 16, which can be a difficult age for folks, and saying, what would you say to Charles at that age that might either give you a bit more comfort in your experiences ahead, or perhaps a little more courage or a little more resilience for the days ahead, what would you go back and tell Charles at 16 based upon everything you've learned?
It gets better. I think that's what I would say to 16-year-old me if I could. I was not a happy teenager. I mean, it was totally me. Like had a very lovely, loving family and a lovely upbringing and went to a nice school, but I was not happy. I struggled to fit in. That was part of it. I didn't really feel like I belonged anywhere. And I was in quite a dark place at 16, if I'm honest. Had what we would now call mental health problems, quite serious ones, and, some self-harming type behaviour that went along with that, I think. So I'm getting a bit overly real maybe for a podcast, but anyway, you asked the question. So I think, yeah, it'll get better. And actually, for me, it got better quite quickly. When I went to university, I started to find people who were like me. And so university was a huge thing for me because I wasn't in a great state when I arrived, and I, probably drank an awful lot too much and smoked too much and that kind of thing. But fundamentally, I had a great time. And I started to realize that there were people around who liked some of the things that I liked and were interesting. And that really helped. And I think knowing that I would get to lead a life that was interesting and creative, and that wasn't how I, like most 16-year-olds, I probably wanted to be a rock star or something, which, was probably never going to happen, to be honest. But I've been able to craft a career for myself that has been interesting and creative. I've also, met a wonderful woman. I've been married 25 years. I have 2 amazing children. And that's come with its own set of challenges, but it's also been joyful. I live in a beautiful house. Life has been pretty good. And if you told me that at 16, I'd have bitten your arm off, I think. There's no way I would have believed it. Yeah, it gets better. There you go. And I suspect that's true for a lot of teenagers. Maybe not all of them, but I think for a lot of us, I think it can be quite a difficult time. And maybe if I can cheat a bit and add a second thing, it's,
yeah, please.
Just keep trying things. Take lots of shots on goal. My career has really been a series of random accidents. I never had a plan. I never really knew where I was going. I still don't. I just had got very good at spotting the next interesting thing out of the corner of my eye and going, oh, that's interesting, I'll do that. And for me, being, I don't know how to put it, like micro ambitious. Like, whatever the thing you've been asked to do that thing as well as you can. But I never had like a grand plan, like in 20 years or 30 years time I'll be doing this. That's just not how I work. So what I do is I try and do everything I do as well as I can do it, and keep watching out for in the corner of your eye. There's the next interesting thing over there. Let's go and do that, and not get too hung up on how someone else is doing.
What a wonderful 2 questions. It's a great reason to have 2 questions, I think. And actually, it reminds me very much of a book that Tim Minchin, again, a very musical individual, as well as incredibly funny and incredibly intelligent, smart as well, has written this book. I can't recall the title completely, but I think it's along the lines of "You Don't Need to Have a Dream." And I think the subtitle is perhaps the subtitle might chime, Charles, I think, in respect of its was it guidance for the incrementally ambitious.
Brilliant. That's a much better phrasing than what I just came up with. I shall have to look that up. It sounds like we will be very congruent in our thinking. But yes, absolutely.
And with that, we'll leave it there, Charles. Thank you so much today for joining the podcast. And I think sharing so many experiences, anecdotes, advice, pointers, and also being so candid and honest. It's certainly the sort of thing we want on the podcast. So no apologies ever necessary for that sort of candor. It's the sort of thing I think every listener will chime with, and certainly our younger audience as well. And that's one of the reasons we like to drop that last question in there, is just to give them the bolster they need to know that, as you said, it gets better.
Russ, thank you very much. It's been an absolute joy. Really enjoyed this. Thank you.
And that's it for this podcast episode. There will be more coming soon. And if you are interested in any of the information about the Eastbourne Literary Festival, then please pop along to our website. The link will be in the information that goes out with the podcast. And if you are interested in being on the podcast, then also go and reach out to us at the website, and we'd love to hear from you.